Hello and welcome to the Carolina Snowflakes Podcast, where two Southerners come to terms with their liberal snowflake tendencies. We're your hosts. I'm Amanda.
And I'm Jason. And we are here with episode number 16 of the Carolina Snowflakes Podcast. We're calling this one, We Flunked Out of Electoral College. Which, I can't imagine a human being not being aware of this election anywhere in the world, let alone in America.
That's right.
So that happened, and it's been everywhere. When we're recording this is Saturday. This morning is when they announced the president-elect to be Joe Biden.
Woohoo!
So from Tuesday until now, Saturday, we haven't exactly known. It's been election week.
It's been a whole week, and it's been a roller coaster of ups and downs.
Yeah,
and all sorts of feelings and fears and anxieties and
yes,
poor coping mechanisms.
I have felt feelings. That's something I can say with this election.
I think a lot of people have felt feelings this week.
So that's where we're at right now in time. That being said, we can look at some of the data. We have some of the returns. We know enough about the election to make some assessments of what happened.
Some judgments.
Mm-hmm. And I don't think I'm the lone Democrat or lefty out there feeling disappointed or like this. Even though happy that Biden has the nomination, like it did not go well.
Yeah.
The election as a whole.
It was not a big blue wave.
No, and that's what everyone wanted, and that definitely didn't happen.
Right.
And some other things that are not so good happened. There were pros, though. There were pros and cons, and I think we should discuss a couple of those just real quick. Okay. One of the pros, weed, marijuana, drugs in general did really, really well. They won in all the places they were up. So go drugs.
2020, the year of drugs.
Yeah, you're going to need them this year.
Yeah.
And then, that's a plus. That was good. And, Biden getting the actual nomination, that's good. But let's say Lindsey Graham just stomped Jamie Harrison in South Carolina.
He did.
It was bad. So Graham won by over 10% in the polls.
Wow.
Now he was the polls had him at like a dead heat, or had that race at almost a dead heat, like tighter than dick skin. You know what I mean? And it was not. It was an absolute stomping. And Jamie Harrison raised $57 million.
I was gonna say that's too bad because
for that race,
that campaign, there was a lot of money in it.
Yeah.
Think about all the ads that we saw and listened to, and they were everywhere.
Yeah. That doesn't fill me with hope. Maybe it might
at least not for
else.
South Carolina, no.
Yeah, so that might be a con from this election, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Can you think of any pros or cons?
The biggest con right now is in a wheelchair, and his name is Madison Cawthorn.
Yeah, Madison Cawthorn won. So Colonel Mo Davis was his opponent. He lost.
He did.
Retired colonel. He was the Democrat. Madison Cawthorn, if you don't know, is a gigantic douchebag who has like a popped collar. He's a Trump guy. He's 25 years old, and he's going to be the youngest member of the House since the 1800s.
Yeah, absolutely ridiculous. The child has no experience whatsoever.
Yeah.
Literally, his only job before this was Chick-fil-A and suing his friend in a construction company to get a few $1 million.
Yeah, he's kind of the worst. And he tweeted something about like, go cry, liberals.
Yeah, on the night that he won, he takes to Twitter and says, go cry, lib.
Yeah.
Like, okay, great. This shows the emotional and intelligence and maturity of the person who's now going to represent me.
Another con that I could think of, being that I live in the state of North Carolina, is they haven't even counted or reported North Carolina votes yet, but the election's already called.
Yeah, that's a little bit disappointing.
Yeah, as someone in North Carolina, your vote never even really got a chance to get counted.
Yeah, how am I supposed to feel if I took the time to vote and I voted absentee, but I delivered my ballot in person because I wasn't sure if the Postal Service was going to mess it up. So I'm like, so basically that whole transaction and ordeal really didn't matter, at least in the presidential election.
Yeah, North Carolinians can rest assured that their votes for other things counted, but for president, it's kind of hard to say that it counted because
it's been called and our state still hasn't actually put the tallies out,
And that is because of a thing called the Electoral College.
Indeed.
And that's kind of what this episode is going to be about.
It is.
We do kind of want to say a couple of more things about this election before we get into the specifics of the Electoral College. One of those things is that the polls were way off. It was ridiculous.
They were way off, and it's funny because they were off in 2016 too.
They were worse this time.
Yeah.
Which is hard to believe, and I have some numbers. They called Florida, I got this info, by the way, from a website called 538 that does sort of a blend of all the polls and gives the averages. They were calling Florida from anywhere from +3 to +5% for Biden, and the result was Trump by 3%. So that's
that's a huge difference when you think about going from a negative to a positive.
Yes, right. That's 6 to 10% off. That's way off.
Yes.
Florida was way off. They called Georgia dead even to somewhere all the way up to +6 for Biden.
Okay.
Which is crazy. And the result is dead even. They're doing a recount.
Yeah, they just ordered a recount for the state.
So that one wasn't too bad, although some polls had it way too high for Biden.
Mm-hmm.
This one is the bad one, I think. They called Ohio by Biden by +4, anywhere to Trump by 1. So Trump by 1 to Biden by 4. The result was Trump by over 8.
Oh.
Yeah.
Wow.
Ouch.
That's huge.
Yeah, that's gigantic. They really botched Ohio.
Whoopsies.
Yeah. Wisconsin, they called Biden by 2 to Biden by 17 was the highest I saw, which is insane.
That's ridiculous.
The result is less than 1% for Biden.
Wow.
It was actually 48.9% to 49.6%.
Wow.
As of the time we're recording this was this morning. And they called Michigan for Biden by +2 to all the way to +12 for Biden. Like I said, some of these polls got crazy. And the result was about +3 for Biden. So there was a lot more hope in Wisconsin. And then the big one that you're probably going to hear about if you haven't already is Miami-Dade County in Florida. In 2016, the result was Hillary Clinton 65, Trump 35. So it was a absolute stomping. And then 2020, the result was Biden 54, Trump 46.
So a lot closer.
So he picked up 11%.
Yeah.
In that county. That is in a humongous county. That is a giant bump. And they didn't predict that at all. The polls had Biden significantly handling by up to 20 and 30%. So what the hell happened there?
Well, the whole thing, I mean, from state to state is disappointing to some degree.
Yeah.
Back to that wishing for a big blue wave.
Mm-hmm. That didn't happen.
This didn't happen at all. And it was really just down to the hair. I mean...
Yeah.
A lot of nail biting, a lot of, comfort eating and trying to get through it because at no point did it seem clear that either one was going to be the winner.
Yeah, it was stressful and crazy.
Yeah.
And the polls were way off, even worse than they were before, which is kind of concerning. Did the polls mean anything?
Yeah, it's kind of the point now. Like, do they matter? Do we need to put stock and or faith or hope in polls anymore?
It certainly seems like they're only indicators. They're not actually all that dependable, but they give you an idea at least.
They do. I think what has happened with the 24-hour news cycle is we've just gotten a little too dependent on polls, as opposed to them just being presented during a nightly news segment as a possibility. They're now being presented 24/7 and being used more as like, see, this is what America wants.
Yeah.
As a more grounded and affirmative stance. It's
kind of interesting because it makes me wonder if we had less coverage of the polls and more coverage of like the issues, if things would change. If the coverage of the polls causes the problem, like if it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Maybe.
So aside from the polls being massively off, there's been a few things that I think a lot of liberals have been thinking about. I know I have. I've been asking myself a few questions.
Oh, yeah?
And I think we all sort of have. I just think I articulate them really well because I'm hella smart.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. So the real question, did Democrats spend too much focus on Donald Trump instead of worrying about Mitch McConnell, the Senate, and the House? I've been asking myself that question. It's hard to say because you have to get rid of Trump. He's the big evil orange demon man.
Yeah, he's the tangerine tyrant.
On one hand, but on the other hand, you have the evil turtle man packing the courts and doing all kinds of Republican crazy stuff behind closed doors.
Mitch McConnell.
Yeah, and the Democrats did have a legit chance at taking the Senate this time, but it did not happen.
Didn't pan out, no.
I mean, it's closer now.
It is closer, but No.
And the question I think we're all asking ourselves is, was that because we focus so hard on Donald Trump? It's a legit question.
It's a valid one.
That leads me to the next question I've been asking myself, which is, would more focus on the Senate and the House had made it so that when Joe Biden theoretically does take office, he would have had a mandate to govern as opposed to an obstructionist Congress, which is what he's going to have.
I mean, arguably, yeah.
Yeah. So like the benefit maybe could have been, maybe we should have focused more on the House. But then again, if that happened when we didn't beat Donald Trump, it would have been pointless.
Yeah, it would have been moot.
It's like some weird catch-22. And I imagine they were all thinking about this before.
I'm sure. I mean, they pay people a lot of money to strategize and come up with plans of attack.
Yeah, so in some ways, these things I'm thinking about are just like, obviously, 2020 after the fact.
Right.
Hindsight vision.
Hindsight,
but I feel it's legitimate questions that we're all sort of mulling over.
Yeah, because I think it stems probably from the fact that it wasn't a big blue wave.
Right. Which
what did we do wrong, or not wrong, but what could we have done better?
Yeah. Theoretically, the Democrats shouldn't have had to spend any money against Donald Trump. They should have just been able to be like, look at this guy.
Yeah, just look at him.
Read his Twitter feed.
Yeah.
Instead, we're going to spend all our time talking about the evil stuff that you don't see on Twitter every day, like Mitch McConnell.
Yeah, in his deep, dark cave, passing legislature and shoveling Republican judges through the system.
And then I've been asking myself if Republicans are getting pushed into a position where they have to rig the rules in order to have like sort of a minority rule.
But haven't they always rigged the rules, if we're being
kind of, but
honest?
Kind of, but they used to be Democrats when they originally did that.
Well, you're going way back. I'm talking more like within the last 30, 40 years.
Yeah. And I think it's because the electorate's changing and we're getting a younger, more browner, less white voters, and which means the Republican Party's forced into being, anti-small d Democratic and trying to steal the elections instead of win them.
Right, because they're like, well, I don't think we're going to appeal to these folks.
Mm-hmm.
Although, to your point earlier, they did to a degree, because in Miami-Dade County, they got a lot of the Cuban vote.
And that's been making me think about this weird split in the Republican Party where I think you have half of them that are trying to say we need to expand who we appeal to. And then you have the Trump part of them that are like, no, we need to just rig the system so that we always win by appointing judges and legal things. And it's like, I prefer the first one. That's just a little bit more civil.
I'd rather fight over a voter than to have you going sneakily behind our backs and switching up judges and just being like, nothing to see here.
Exactly.
Look over there. I
think that's part of why the party seems so disjointed right now, because there's that, I don't know idealistically which side they're really falling on.
I think they're whichever one works in that moment.
Yeah, that seems to be where we're at.
It's gross.
And part of the reason why the system is gameable, why they can even game the system, is because we use a system called the Electoral College.
We do.
It's a complicated, ridiculous system that enables them to be able to game it.
It's the most convoluted system of voting that there is.
And because of that, a minority party can seek to win with minority votes. And that is what has happened several times and damn near happened this time.
That's right.
And that leads us into talking about the Electoral College.
Which we flunked out of.
Yes.
Well, I got a lot to say about just how fucked the Electoral College really is.
Yes, I can imagine. You have some notes there.
I do have some notes. And in learning more about this thing, WTF?
Yeah.
Question mark.
All right, let's hear it.
All right, Electoral College, y'all. So most democracies around the world elect their national leader with a popular vote.
Because,
because that makes sense.
Yeah.
Whoever gets the most votes wins. It's very straightforward, and it makes sense.
It's the way you vote for, say, class president.
It's how you vote for just about anything.
Yeah.
But not here in the U.S. No. We use the Electoral College, which is a group of delegates from each state.
Right.
So when America votes for a president, what they're actually voting for is who their state will elect.
Okay. Yeah. So you're not even really voting for president.
I mean, you are, but you aren't, if that makes sense, because it's not a popular vote.
Right.
This is why every once in a while, a candidate wins the presidency without winning the quote, the popular vote. Would you like to take a guess as to how many times that has happened?
Well, I know it's happened twice that I can remember, so I'm going to assume it happened another time after besides that I don't know about. So I'm going to guess 3.
Close, but no, it actually has happened 5 times that we've had a president win on the Electoral College vote.
Wow.
Without winning the popular vote.
Wow.
The first time was back in 1824.
Okay.
When John Quincy Adams was elected by the House of Representatives when neither he nor his opponents were able to secure a majority of electoral votes.
Oh, so it was like tied. And
they
called it for him.
Yeah,
okay.
So what happens, the way the Electoral College works is if for some reason neither candidate actually takes the lead or reaches the 270 as it is set now, it's up to Congress to vote.
Yeah, and they just decided.
Yeah, and so that's what happened way back then.
Imagine if that would have happened this time. Holy crap.
Yikes. And in that election, it was Andrew Jackson who was running against Adams, and Jackson actually won the popular vote.
Unfortunately for the Native Americans,
yes.
That is what happened.
Then it happened again in 1876 with Rutherford B. Hayes, who won the majority of electoral votes but lost the popular vote against his opponent, Samuel Tilden. And the outcome in this one was so contentious and disputed that a commission had to be formed and a compromise was established the following year in that Rutherford B. Hayes had to formally agree that he would not seek re-election after his 4-year term. Yep.
Oh, you can be president supposing you don't. Wow.
Yeah, they made him sign a thing to promise not to run again.
Whoa.
Yeah, so it happened.
That's bizarre.
Then it happened again in 1888 with Grover Cleveland.
Huh.
He was the incumbent. And he won the popular vote, but lost the electoral vote to Benjamin Harrison. And Cleveland would later successfully seek a second term 4 years after, becoming the only president in U.S. history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's theoretically possible, but it just only happened that one time.
One time.
That's interesting.
So that was 1888.
Huh. Yeah, it's been a while.
Didn't happen again.
Yeah.
For over 100 years.
Until 2000.
Which takes me back to my 9th grade civics class, in which we learned about the Electoral College, what it serves and why it exists. And I specifically remember learning that the possibility of a candidate not winning or winning the popular vote and not winning the electoral or vice versa just doesn't happen.
Yep. They told me the same thing. They were like, it's super unlikely you'll ever see that.
Yeah, they were like, because we were like, well, what happens if they don't line up? And they were like, oh, don't worry about that. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Wrong.
As Trump would say, wrong.
In 2000, which, by the way, was the year that I turned 18 and was first able to vote for the president, it happened.
I was 16. I couldn't yet vote, but man, I remember it.
So George W. Bush, remember him?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
W.
The sort of slow cowboy.
Yeah.
Yes.
He won the election through electoral votes, but Al Gore was the popular vote winner.
And what do you know? It was Florida where the polls were all off.
Exactly. Results hinged on voting in Florida.
What do you know?
Everything was screwy. Still is, kind of. And the counts were so close that a recount was ordered amongst an entire sea of litigation happening in counties all across Florida. And these lawsuits made their way to the Florida Supreme Court, who then bumped them up to the federal Supreme Court of the United States, who then had to make the decision of where these Florida electoral votes were going to go.
I think it might be part of the reason people around our age are so disillusioned by the election in general is because that was my first real exposure to voting, was that whole disaster.
And they decided those are going to go to Bush.
Yeah, they did do that.
To be noted, Bush's brother, Jeb,
was the governor.
Happened to be governor at the time.
Yeah.
And it's like, coincidence?
Wonder if that mattered.
Yeah, did that matter? And also, that was the year of the hanging Chad. Because in Florida, at that point, they were voting on punch cards that they ran through a little machine, and some of the holes being punched apparently didn't go all the way through, leading to confusion over who was voting for who. And those little hangy tabs were called hanging chads, and that's all they talked about on the news every day was hanging chads.
I remember.
So that happened.
Yeah.
And then, of course, more recently in 2016, it happened with all Hillary and Donald J. Trump.
That one was so sad.
Hillary won the popular vote, but lost the election to Trump, who won the electoral vote.
Luckily, Biden won the popular vote harder than she did.
He did. We had a far greater turnout.
Yeah, so that's good news.
In total than in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
I think people felt motivated.
I think some people who didn't vote in 2016 were like, oh, shit.
Like, I got to do that.
Yeah.
I got to do that next time. So the majority of Americans actually don't like our voting system.
No shit.
And they haven't for a really long time. So then that begs the question of, like, why then do we do it this way?
I know a little about that.
Well, ultimately it boils down to it's because it benefits some more so than others, and those some tend to be the ones in charge.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason that it's set up the way that it is.
For sure there is.
So a little bit of what is the Electoral College.
Mm-hmm.
It's based on congressional representation, where each state has a set number of representatives based on the population size of that state. States with higher populations have a greater number of congressional representatives and thus a greater number of electoral college votes. Each state also has 2 senators, so each state gets 1 electoral college vote for each congressional representative and 1 for each senator.
Right.
And what happens is that due to this arrangement, the weight and importance of a person's vote becomes greater in smaller, less populated states.
Right.
So, for example, Texas, 1 electoral college member in Texas represents 664,000 voters.
Right.
By comparison, Vermont, much smaller state, smaller population, 1 electoral college member represents only 210,000 people voting.
Correct. And you have the same problem with just the Senate in general, since every state gets 2.
Yeah, everything's a little wonky.
Uh-huh.
So this makes each individual person's vote in Vermont way more influential than a person's vote in Texas. It carries more weight. And the Electoral College creates discrepancies like these all across the United States. Another example, an individual vote in Wyoming is 3.5 times more influential than a vote in California.
Yeah, and if you start to think about who lives in those places, you start to get a sort of an indication as to why that this might be that way.
Exactly. And so the winner of the presidency is whichever candidate gets 270 or more of these electoral college votes. And almost all states follow the same rules when deciding electoral votes. Whichever candidate wins the popular vote in the state gets all of the state's electoral votes. Some states are so predictable that we already know the outcome.
So this is where I would like to point out that the idea that the states decide how they want to do their electors means, if you really nitpick at the law, it means that you never have voted for president and you don't actually have the right to vote for president. The state has a right to determine how it sends electors however it wants. They're nice enough to let us vote and go by our vote.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize that we actually don't have the right to vote.
No, not for president.
It actually falls under the legislature of the state to vote.
Correct. Your rights that you're guaranteed to vote do guarantee you the right to vote for House, and they do guarantee you the right to vote in local elections. And I think that's where this kind of falls in.
Right. So back to Electoral College and predictable states.
Right.
These are the trends that basically shape where candidates campaign during the election year. In 2016, Hillary won the popular vote and thus all electoral votes in California.
Right.
She knew she had California in the bag, so she never even campaigned there.
Yeah, why bother?
She never even stopped by to wave and say hello. And likewise, Trump knew that he was going to win Texas, and so he only held 1 rally in Texas during the time that he was campaigning.
Right. It was he did that just to feel better, though. I don't even think that was for the election.
Yeah, it was just something to do. Yeah, it was like in the neighborhood or something.
He just likes doing that shit.
But this sends the message to American voters that if you live in a swing state, that you're more important.
Oh, yeah.
Than someone. You're more important, you're more special than someone living in a, quote, predictable state.
That's fun.
Yeah, thanks.
That does a lot of good for the American psyche.
And swing states in general have more influence on election outcomes, thus votes matter more there. And they also benefit from a greater volume of campaign spending.
Right, oh yeah.
So all those advertising dollars going to local outlets, the funds going to event complexes, and then the community benefiting from the influx of people attending these rallies and events that are being hosted by the committees. I mean, when you're in a swing state, you're just kind of winning all around. You're getting the attention and you're getting the money.
Sorry, Alaska, no one's coming to campaign there, dog.
But the Electoral College has always been about shifting power away from some to give to others. Mm-hmm. It's in the actual design of the process. So if we take a trip back in time and we go back to 1787 and 1788, when there were just a handful of states, our country's founders needed everyone to get on board with the Constitution. They were like, we've written this thing. We want all of you guys to sign it, please.
There's a great quote from George Washington where he's basically saying, what we're doing is making a piece of paper that we're then going to get everyone to agree on. That's a crazy idea. I don't think that's going to work. Well, I mean, they were not all that optimistic if you read what they had to say about it.
Right. And I don't really blame them.
I don't either. It's a crazy idea.
Well, it didn't go over great.
Yeah.
There was some resistance.
Right.
Specifically with southern states and slavery. So basically, the northern states wanted only, quote, free people to count towards the population when determining how many electoral representatives that the state would get.
And if they had it that way, then the North would never lose an election.
Right. Mm-hmm. So the South, which was pro-slavery,
wasn't cool with that.
Didn't like this suggested arrangement since they didn't want those damn Yankees having all the power. So they wanted their slaves to count towards the population, even though slaves themselves couldn't vote. And so the South said, we ain't signing a damn thing until our demands are met. And thus was born the 3/5 Compromise. An enslaved person would count as 3/5 of a person, and that total number would count towards the total population.
Yeah, and I believe they picked that number because that was just about the amount they needed to have a chance to win elections.
Yeah, it's pretty gross.
Convenient.
It's pretty gross.
It's horrible. It's the worst thing I've ever heard, but it's in the Constitution, so...
And even after slavery was abolished and voting rights were given to Black people, Southern leaders still found ways to simultaneously keep Black people around, yet restrict their freedom to vote, such as poll taxes, literacy tests, or even just violence.
We're still doing it. I'd argue that by making people wait 8 hours in line without having a federal holiday, that is the equivalent of a poll tax.
Absolutely. It's still happening. So basically, the Southern states wanted the population size afforded to them by Black people, but didn't want Black people to actually have a say in elections.
Right.
And I think they probably still feel that way today.
I think a lot of them do.
Mm-hmm. Congress has attempted several times to actually get rid of the Electoral College.
Yeah, they have.
The first being back in 1816 when the proposal was blocked by Southern states. What do you know?
Yeah, what do you know?
And they got super close to almost getting rid of it in 1969 when the House passed a bill, so it had support from both sides, but yet again made it to the Senate, and the Southern Senate said, mm-mm.
And when we say they said, mm-mm, what happened was what's called a filibuster.
Right.
That's a whole other can of worms, but the filibuster is something that caused them to be able to do all of this.
Yeah, so the southern states, the southern senators blocked that bill in 1969, saying that the Electoral College is one of the few safeguards left to protect southern representation.
Right, and we're basically going to read out of the phone book until you guys stop trying this.
Yeah, so just give it up.
That's what happened.
Yes.
It's gross.
When you look at the states that benefit the most from the Electoral College, meaning they have a lower population size relative to the number of electors representing them.
Right.
They tend to be predominantly white. So think of like Wyoming, Montana, Rhode Island, and the Dakotas, for example. That's not the racial makeup of the rest of the country.
It's not even close.
However, like not at all.
Yeah.
And these states also tend to be, though not always, they do tend to be Republican leaning and often are considered Republican strongholds, whereas states with larger population and thus greater diversity are typically Democrat states. And this is why both George W. Bush and Donald Trump won the Electoral College despite not winning the popular vote.
That's correct.
I do want to make a note here. Although it's generally assumed that electors will side with the popular vote winner in their state.
There's no reason they have to.
And the majority do.
Yeah.
They actually promise to. It's part of like...
Yeah, they like a scout's honor.
Yeah, they hold up their hand like, I do promise to vote for whoever wins the popular vote. However, they sometimes don't.
Yeah, there's a name for it.
And those are called the faithless electors.
Faithless. I love that name. It's like, we don't have any faith in you.
We have no faith in you.
Faithless elector you.
Shame.
It sounds bad, doesn't it?
It does. There were 10 faithless electors in the 2016 election between Hillary and Trump. Interestingly, though, the majority of the faithless electors don't necessarily flip and vote for the other candidate. Between the two, they usually go and vote for a third party, or they refuse to vote at all.
That's a thing they can do.
Now, 33 states do have laws against faithless electors with penalties such as fines or voiding the person's vote altogether, plus a lot of public shaming.
Yeah.
Like,
it's a horrible, if you're a faithless elector, it's like calling you a apostate.
To be chosen to be an elector in the Electoral College is a very esteemed thing to have. So a lot of times the people who are chosen are very active and engaged members of their political party. They're the people that always go to the rallies and the conventions. They volunteer. So there's a lot of esteem in it. You're supposed to go with the popular vote. And if you don't, there's going to be some repercussions. You're going to also probably be shunned quite a bit.
Yeah, I would shun you with shame.
But where it gets a little weird is
if it wasn't weird enough.
Right. No, it gets weirder, y'all.
It gets weirder, y'all.
As if things weren't convoluted and weird enough as is, how the members of the Electoral College are chosen varies state by state.
Yeah.
Like there's no two states that are exactly the same.
No,
really.
why would that be?
Why would we? So some states choose their electors during primary voting.
Yeah.
You go during the primaries to pick your candidate, and you also pick your elector. Other states, like North Carolina, which I'm much more familiar with, choose their electors during their state's party conventions. Like, that's part of the deal.
Yeah.
That's why our conventions are so important.
So like if they have the DNC or the RNC you're talking about, like the big conventions?
Not the national, it's the state convention.
State conventions,
yeah.
Okay.
So like for example, the North Carolina Democrat convention.
Right. Interesting.
That's where they would choose the delegates to be in the Electoral College.
I didn't actually know that's how we did it here. Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Or you have states like Pennsylvania, where the electors are chosen by the campaign committee of each candidate running.
Sure.
Okay. And in other states, the electors are not just regular citizens at all. They're high-ranking and or well-known state officials up to and including governors.
Sure.
So there's not a lot of consistency across the country when it comes to who's chosen for the position and what qualifies them and how they get there.
When they were doing the Constitution and the constitutional or whatever constitutional Congress, and they were meeting and they were having their meetings, they took a week's vacation when they were doing the Electoral College section because they weren't exactly sure how it was going to go. So it got left to like an even smaller group of people than the Continental Congress. It was like the skeleton.
It was
crew.
like 4 guys who were working night shift.
And they came back from vacation and were like, "This is what you guys got," and they were like, "Man, it's the best we got.
This is it."
Yeah, it's either this or
it.
I don't know. The pressure to get the document signed is why it exists.
Yeah.
They didn't have another option.
Right. They had to come up with something that would somehow work. I'm using air quotes.
Yeah.
Work. And at the same time, appease all the demands being made coming at them.
And it's interesting. There has been one legal change to the Electoral College in the history of the Electoral College. There's only been one time they've changed it. And that was because originally the electors would vote and there was only one set of votes. They would vote once, and the person who got the most votes would become president. The person who got the second most votes would become vice president. And it didn't take but 3 or 4 elections before that idea seemed
because you're
foolish.
going to end up with one party as the president and another party as the vice president.
And that's what happened, and they were fighting over who got to be
they're
in
like
charge.
knocking each other out, wrestling in the Oval Office.
So
that's not going to work.
Within a couple of elections, and I don't have the data for sure on me, but it was at the very beginning. They switched the Electoral College to make it so that they have 2 separate votes. They actually vote for president and vote for vice president separately, which is a good thing. Because that didn't work.
No, and I don't think that that's a terrible idea.
And you did mention the attempted changes that got shot down. There was another one. Eisenhower tried to change the Electoral College. He threatened it a lot, and he used that to push other legislation through. And so there is a history of sort of using the Electoral College as like a cudgel to beat other things through.
Yeah,
like if you don't
leverage.
Yeah, if you don't do this, we're going to do this. So it's been a political pawn ever since the beginning, and I think it still is.
And at this point in time, with the size that our country is, I feel like, do we really need to still have this thing around?
I don't think so.
I don't either. Let's just get rid of it and go to popular vote.
And I feel like it's right next to the filibuster, which we also need to get rid of.
Agreed.
I think we're going to do at some point an episode on that because the filibuster is a whole can
Maybe
of worms.
we'll just have a filibuster.
Yeah, maybe we'll just read the
let our
phone book.
Listeners experience it for themselves.
Yeah, it's...
They'll never listen again.
Yeah, no, they won't. It's the reason no one watches C-SPAN.
Yeah.
This has begged another couple questions to me, just like with the Electoral College. So if it's population that translates to electors, and that's where the problem is, right? The problem is that there are some states that are guaranteed the +2 from the Senate.
Yes.
That with such small populations that gives them massively bigger
back to
leverage.
my example with Vermont, their population size dictates they actually only have 1 representative.
Exactly.
But then they have 2 senators, which gives them 3 electoral votes.
And I was thinking about this, if that's the problem, then that means that the Senate is just an inherent problem as well.
I would agree.
And I want to say, I think a lot of the founders of the Constitution would have also agreed. Originally, they didn't want people voting for president or for Senate.
Right.
Originally, and this was when only it was white slave-holding men that could vote. And even then, they were skeptical of letting people decide the Senate or the president. They were like,
humans though.
Yeah.
Am I right?
And that was how it was originally. They did change it. So, they went on vacation and got changed is basically what happened.
Yeah, it was the night crew.
And there were questions at the beginning of this whole thing about mob rule, right? Like, if we let people vote, that's the same as mob rule. That's chaos. That's just letting the mob decide. And what do mobs know? They don't know anything. When you get a group of people thinking something, they can be crazy.
Well, we've seen that.
And so there was this like overtones of mob rule and chaos and a fear of that in the early framing of the Constitution. And it's part of the reason we ended up with the Electoral College.
I would argue that it's probably connected to some guilty consciences as well.
Right. And so it makes me ask, if they're worried about mob rule, exactly, it's projection, right? Like they're worried about mob rule and chaos. Is that sort of coming back with this whole Donald Trump trying to stop counting votes? It seems to be a similar train of thought. This idea that letting people in charge is chaos. Letting people have a vote is inherently a tyranny. They call it the tyranny of the majority. And that is a place where part of the Republican Party is right now, and it's terrifying.
Yeah, that's a little concerning.
That's a scary place that we're at, isn't it?
Yeah, and where they say, like, yeah, you're a person and you have freedom, but we just don't really trust you to make decisions, so we're going to do that for you.
Exactly. And it really lines up with the way they were thinking about it at the beginning, except they were way more explicit and said only white slave-owning men.
Right.
But it's the same logic,
yeah,
is my point. Like, it's slipping into today, and you can see it. And I find that really scary, fascinating, interesting, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
Another thing it makes me think is that, so during the Three-Fifths Compromise, the Electoral College was doing some really heavy lifting. I mean, it was basically guaranteeing the South winning everything.
Yeah.
And now we're at a place where we're kind of in dead heats. So has the Electoral College lost some of its ability to control things over time? I think it kind of has, because freeing of slaves and giving the vote to women and black people has somewhat lessened the control that the Electoral College has, but it's still pretty bad.
The Electoral College still does have greater positive effects on the Republican Party and greater negative effects on the Democrat Party. It's math.
Yeah, and it used to be the opposite when the parties were different, and that's part of confusing thing too. So when all the racists were Democrats instead of Republicans,
right? We had to. Yeah, that's another part of American history.
Yeah,
we switched,
but it's been doing the same thing, and that's giving the smaller, more rural, more likely to be racist places more power.
My problem when I think about it is, like, less so about that side of things and just thinking about the campaigning. The fact that we have states that never once even are visited by the candidates is so gross to me. If it was a popular vote, then it would be up to that candidate to get their rear end on a bus and a plane and visit every single state and let every person there know that their vote matters.
I agree 100%. I think most of America wants it to be that way. And the reason that it's not is because it would take a 2/3 vote in the House and a 2/3 vote in the Senate to change the Constitution to enable that, and that ain't happening.
At least not anytime soon.
No. There's no freaking way, and that's what's so gross. And part of the reason for that is the filibuster, which ties into this whole thing, and it's a disaster as well.
Correct.
It's like they're two twins of destruction that have just been wreaking havoc on our government system for a long time.
And you would have to have both parties basically agreeing that no one is benefiting from the Electoral College or not feeling like they are benefiting. And that's just not where we are currently.
Yeah. It's interesting because of our donation laws. We're now in a place where you can't, like, if I wanted to donate, say, to the most the most important race for my money to go to as a liberal, there's really not a way for me to do that. I can pick a candidate, and I can pick the candidate who's running against somebody I don't like the most, a la Jamie Harrison and Lindsey Graham. But that doesn't really help the Liberal Party because he never really had a chance at winning that.
Right.
And I think the parties used to be a lot different, and that was actually how it worked. You just gave money to the party, and they doled it out to the most important spaces. But we've changed all the laws, and the rules are different now, and that's not how it works. And I think that's another kink or another monkey wrench that's gotten thrown into this whole can of worms and make things confusing because there's now giant amounts of money going to the wrong places because it's individuals who are deciding instead of parties.
Right.
And I don't know how good or bad that is, but it's certainly confusing and seems to provide a lot of waste.
For sure.
So I don't know. I don't know how to fix it, but I do know popular vote would be nice.
Yeah, just make it simple and straightforward.
So Joe Biden, if you're listening to this, get rid of the filibuster, give us a popular vote. That would be pretty dope.
And try not to sniff anyone.
And try not to sniff any little kids. We know you're gonna, though.
Yeah, I know you can't help yourself.
And he's gonna stutter while he does it. He's a good dude, but yeah. And that does it for the Electoral College section. But now we have a bit we call the Mic Check Minute. Hello and welcome to the Carolina Snowflakes Podcast, where two Southerners do checks on the microphones. Check. So this guy calls you out of nowhere, and he's like, I was camping in the goddamn woods in fucking North Carolina, and I was doing my own business at 1 o'clock in the morning. This motherfucking park ranger comes out of nowhere, pepper sprays the dog.
He said...
Did he sound like... I made him sound like Jeff Foxworthy there.
You made him sound... He didn't really sound like that.
Pepper sprayed the dog.
They were from Mississippi, I think. So still Southern. But yeah, he was like, my family and I were in the woods at the parkway trying to enjoy a beautiful weekend camping, and this park ranger came out in the middle of the night and sprayed my dog in the face with pepper spray. And of course, then I get it in my face because naturally dog's going to get it on you. And then it gets my wife's lungs. And I'm going to sue the Park Service and the federal government for ruining my vacation.
Awesome. And that does it for this week's episode. If you like what you heard, you can find our website at
carolinasnowflakes.com.
We also have a Facebook page that's getting more and more popular by the day.
Yeah, we're getting some fans.
And you can find us on there at
facebook.com/Carolina Snowflakes.
And if you, like us, flunked out of Electoral College and just feel like the whole thing is a disaster, you can email us and let us know about how you feel at
carolinasnowflakes@gmail.com.
gmail.com.
Thanks for listening. Bye.